Hey guys, we're continuing with Module 8, Crime, Media, and Movements, and moving into Part 3. So let's get started. So remember, in these parts we have discussed court, corrections, and policing. So essentially, we've done court in Part 2. We're moving into corrections for Part 3, and then we'll wrap up with policing in Part 4. So when we discuss media movements and corrections, we have to think about the perception and framing of issues on mass incarceration in the media. And it has an overwhelming impact on public reaction because remember, the prison industrial complex is the one place we can't usually go with cameras and writers and recording devices and journalists. So it's largely off limits to the public. So when we do get stories on prison, they often are very intense and full of all kinds of mystery, and it's kind of like that chance we get to see in there. They also can be kind of hyper sensationalized, so we need to be careful that we're getting an accurate view of prison, and a lot of this is discussed in the Surratt text. However, to some extent, the media is able to raise awareness of the problematic conditions in prison, and we actually have some pretty good examples of that. So first, we ask ourselves two questions. Do media outlets frame issues of mass incarceration in a way that encourages hopelessness? So is it kind of a spotlight on despair? Or essentially, does the media manage to highlight organizations pushing for reform and change? And when we kind of weigh and measure these stories as they come out, either addressing one question or the other, we tend to see more emphasis on issues in mass incarceration than we see in the organizations pushing for reform and change, because that's more of the sensational story. That's where more of the drama is and the public interest lies. They will get a lot more in newsworthiness as far as getting the public to tune in or attend to that message rather than the reform and change message. So when we talk about these organizations, social movement organizations, these are some of the more common ones you may have heard of. We have the Anti-Prison People's Movement Assembly, Students Against Mass Incarceration, where you see chapters on several college campuses. And we certainly have two inmate organizations, the Formerly Incarcerated and the Convicted People's Movement. But to me, one of the highest profile organizations would be the Innocence Project, as far as their public face and their media sophistication. When we talk about prison movements, we focus on several themes. The first theme is actually decarceration. You may have come across this word before. So decarceration really refers to the abolishment of mass incarceration, or at least the large reduction in mass incarceration, moving more towards diversion programs and probation and other kinds of supervision or punishment. We also focus on rights and reforms. And again, some of these cases might move up into the Supreme Court as far as rights of the incarcerated and civil rights. We also focus on releasing wrongfully convicted people. And we just recently talked about that in several cases. We also focus on reducing sentencing terms, especially when it comes to racial disparities. And finally, a last focus we tend to see when we look at prison movements and media, and what catches the media's attention is aligning the prison as the outcome of other needed social reforms or unfairly punishing activists for making quote unquote good trouble. So that's when the prison comes to light if we end up arresting and jailing people that are actively protesting. That's when this starts to become a pedestal or a platform for these people, and they can essentially go down as a kind of a celebrity activist or a martyr for their cause or what have you. Some of the more known prison movements have to do with basically rights and conditions, okay? So what's interesting, though, is the reason it tends to catch media's attention is not only the conditions themselves and how appalling they can be once they're brought to the public eye, but also the fact that inmates can organize revolts or rebellions and uprisings, which is fascinating in and of itself. So we also look at how they organize racially, which is even more difficult to accomplish within a prison, let alone outside a prison. So the racial divisions of US society, which are very intensely felt in a prison, especially when you look at prison gangs, that they can be overcome in prison through these episodic uprisings by rebels. So there's some kind of solidarity that's felt by inmates when they're all experiencing the same conditions regardless of race. And some examples are San Quentin, Attica, Lorton, Auburn, Stateville, and Soledad. And also more recently in Pelican Bay in 2012. That was a larger one as well. So essentially these prison movements would utilize what might be called a strategy of visibility. So they're trying to get notoriety and picked up by local media or even national media if they can, wanting to expose the prison and all these grievances and failings of the institution, with the hopes that once people saw how abusive the system was, that they would revolt and it would bring some justice and reform to their cause. We see this in the form of prison strikes. In the past few years, we've actually seen an unprecedented number of prison strikes, and you see things like labor strikes when inmates revolt against the work release programs and so forth. So that happened in Georgia in December 2010. We also saw massive prison hunger strikes in California that at one point had 12,000 prisoners refusing food and demanding basic human rights. And so you have something that large going on affecting so many inmates and their families, it's kind of hard to ignore it as a journalist. This action sparked similar strikes in Ohio, North Carolina, and Virginia, again, and as well in California. So when we look at, again, more detail of how media starts to get infused, this is where social media really takes a stand and becomes more obvious and utilized. So probably most recently in September of 2018, Americans all along the East Coast were in fear of the wrath of Hurricane Florence and certainly other hurricanes as well. So despite mandatory evacuation orders by South Carolina Governor McMaster for 5 counties, there were 2 prisons in the area that would not be evacuated. So when locals and Twitter users alike were made aware of the evacuation refusal, they made a trending hashtags on Hurricane Florence. They made demands for prison evacuation. So this is sometimes how even a local story that might not have caught much national attention can become viral and become a movement through things like Twitter, where suddenly it's on everyone's radar. Another one not too long ago was Hurricane Katrina. So that brought images of inmates in cells full of chest-high water, sewer-contaminated floodwaters, enduring unbearable heat, power outages, generator failures, and some inmates going days without food and water. So this is quite the photo image portrayal of prison kind of at its worst, its failure to protect inmates while incarcerated. But what's interesting is despite public reporting and advocacy by the ACLU and other groups, the fact remains that because society views prisoners as second-class citizens, their stories have largely gone unnoticed and untold. So when we get into media and how media tells the story of movements in the correctional system, this is the biggest issue and barrier that they run into. We've also seen this happen with civil rights and immigration. So as you may recall, in Phoenix, Arizona, there was a large immigrant rights movement that has been especially fierce, where activists used civil disobedience to shut down the city jail and then formed what they called the Barrio Defense Committee to prevent people from arrest or deportation. So ultimately, activists will seek to confront prisons as both an economic and moral necessity, and they'll use media to try to make their cause much more known. But here's the reality and why sometimes coverage does not happen on these prison movements. So when officials respond to prison movements, ultimately this is what happens. And sometimes this can get sensationalized or catch media attention, but other times it can squash the movement so quickly that it doesn't even have a chance to make it out of the prison. So the state normalized the widespread use of solitary confinement over many decades. So they would identify the leaders and separate them from the group so that the movement became a little bit less organized. And that was a way to crush these movements inside prisons. Inmates were subject to a range of behavior modification programs, especially if the movements had political ties or ties to other movements outside the institution. They would be put on indefinite lockdowns and have limited access to the outside and random attacks or raids by guards and sometimes inmates where they try to pit them against each other or break down the cause. And unfortunately, this has become the dominant model of prison management in America when we have kind of the playbook on how to deal with revolt. And we understand the security issues and the safety issues at play here as well. But again, this is just discussing why certain movements may not get media coverage because they start up quickly and they end quickly. We have to get after some underlying ideologies like we mentioned a few minutes earlier. So again, the public holds that there is an acceptable level of widespread imprisonment, that there is a specter of villainy out there, and whether we label them as illegal immigrants or cop killers or sex criminals or serial killers or what have you, but essentially there is a population of evil people out there waiting in the wings to destroy the American way of life. And so people see prisons as ultimately necessary to keep order and separate the good from the bad. So there is kind of a risk inherent in this really sordid history of prison reform that the current reform impulse will be bifurcated along these poorly defined notions of deservingness, right? So, well, these are inmates and why bother fighting for them? And this is part of their punishment ritual, right? And so that is a very widely held notion in the public, and that will continue to uphold that carceral logic that separates the good people from the bad people. And it also decides that really no fate is too harsh for those who are deemed unworthy of social inclusion. And so stripping rights of inmates or doing inmates favors is not a widely held popular belief out there in the public. It also is highly criticized in political circles. And so sometimes the media kind of follows suit with that notion. But on one final note, this is one other thing to think about. So when we look at coverage, media coverage on people who are victims of prison violence or inmate on inmate attacks or guard on inmate attacks, we get a sense of the other, that they've really been what we call otherized and very much reduced in their identity. So when discussing murder, suicide, and abuse, which are unfortunately very common in prisons, the impact of language that we see in journalist reporting and coverage is all the more damaging. So again, these are a few quotes that I pulled out of some of the research when we've reviewed this. So instead of reporting in a way that exposes the tragedy of prison violence, we get headlines like a convicted rapist was stabbed to death. The media presents the victim as if he could only be the crime he was convicted of and have no other identity whatsoever. And it happens all the time, all over and over again. So when a person is reduced to their crime at the outset, advocates will say that it's really no surprise when challenges to their worth and dignity follow. Again, going back to that deservingness idea, as far as if they are deserving of an outlet, deserving of a voice, or deserving of media coverage. As long as we're talking about people only in terms of what they've done wrong, it's very easy to camouflage the fact that we're talking about human beings. So these are some of the challenges I wanted to bring to light as far as corrections and media movements. And certainly we haven't really even acknowledged the fact that media is very restricted in prison. So prison and inmates and reform is largely dependent on getting noticed by the public and allowing the public to demand coverage or create their own media coverage through, social media campaigns and viral videos. But again, the images and the stories are highly restricted because of security measures, right? Mail is sorted and gone through before it ever reaches an inmate, and anything an inmate sends out of prison is scanned and reviewed. Now, keep in mind, we have had some Pulitzer Prize winning novels that have come out of prisons from people on death row and people that have written stories about their incarceration. So that is one way stories can come out, where they have used media or a publishing medium to get that information out in the public's eye. But again, it's hard to take any one set of anecdotes and say this is how it is in prison. And again, prisons are highly regulated with allowing journalistic access and camera footage to come inside. If you're interested in a journalistic approach to prison, you may want to read the book New Jack by Ted Conover, which essentially a journalist gets a job as a guard for a little over a year in prison, in Sing Sing prison. And he writes in journals about all of his experiences along the way. It is a prize-winning book, and that would be the closest thing we can come to of a journalist doing investigative reporting from the inside out. It's not without its flaws or its biases, and certainly people are skeptic about where this journalist was coming from, the motive and so forth, but it has brought to light a lot of different issues. So those are some things to consider when we think about media and movements and whether or not we have access to them. So certainly it's a very different formula with different things to consider for inmates and for people that work in corrections that are trying to keep rights intact, yet also balance security and safety. It's always a very, very difficult balancing act to make. But hopefully you found this module useful, and we'll see you in the next lecture.